With Plato, Aristotle, Horace, and Longinus out of the way, we are kind of done with the early, classical periods, and we are moving into kind of a bit more of the modern times. And actually, I'd say this is the part where, for a lot of people, criticism stops being boring because there are a lot of people that think, the time period of Plato and Aristotle were kind of boring, which is arguable, but same time understandable. It can be boring to some, but now we actually get into the Renaissance, and it's like arguably, in my opinion, one of the most interesting times when it comes to criticism in general. So the way we'll go at it, because uh, from our syllabus, we have to look at Philip Sidney is very important. But before that, you need to actually know like the history or the social setting behind this. So right now in this video, I'll talk just about the Renaissance and the historical setting, and I'll get into Philip Sidney in the next one. So, the historic background. Now, the thing with here is that as ma'am took in class, she never once mentioned the textbook, and the textbook actually has a very, condensed but important and very informative parts on the historic setting. And she just gave us some notes. So I'll just first quickly read over the notes, then we'll get to the text because I do believe the text is like much more better when it comes to those facts because I don't know what ma'am was thinking. Like maybe she just wanted to quickly move through it, but it can be limiting to some when they don't get, like for me personally, if I don't have every single point connected in a timeline, I can't understand. That's why I had to refer the text. So I'll just read out the points ma'am said in class first. The fall of Constantinople is what led to the Renaissance. We know that, and the people during the time wanted to revive, the earlier things. It happened during the 14th and 15th century in Italy. I don't believe that's exactly the right dates. I'll get into the dates exactly. It's in the text later. Rebirth of values, reason, styles of early Roman and Greek classicals, and it was the only thing to look back to, basically. English literature didn't really have too much history to look back at. When we talk about English here, I'm talking about the region of England, not, English language. So period around 14th century to mid 17th century. Okay, that entire range, we generally call it Renaissance. There was rebirth and rediscovery of values, ethics, and styles of classical Greece and Rome. That's important. They were taken from the old and like the Plato, Aristotle. That time it was a return of that. Literary criticism started by defending the works in Italy, praising as they are classics to be imitated, not the ancient. Now, literary critics at that point started saying that it is the works in Italy, it is the works in France that we see that we have to copy and we have to imitate and praise, and not the ancient works that came before us. The movement reached maturity by achieving independence in 16th century Italy, where the recovery of Aristotle's poetics took into a series of commentaries that extended to the elaboration of comprehensive poetry theory. Okay, here's what where ma'am's points get confusing because I don't think if it was a fault, if it was my issue when I wrote the actual things or the way ma'am was saying it or whatever, because some of these points seem a bit contradictory. Renaissance literary criticism took root in defense of poetry, dialogues of language, and literary imitation in Italy to the 14th and 15th centuries. Though indebted to Horace, Aristotle, and Plato's majority defense against attacks of ancient modern names. Okay, so even though they do talk about Horace, Aristotle, and Plato a lot, what they focused more on was defending poetry against the critics of the time and the time just before them. The Renaissance critics to some extent defended the vernacular as poetic medium. They also saw literature. Okay, again, here's the thing though. She talked about, when ma'am took it in class, she talked about the things and how the poetic criticism at the time, and how and why they criticized. But she never talked about what they were defending against, what the criticism was actually against. You need an actual base to get to, but the base wasn't given. They asserted that poetry must imitate objects, okay, that are real. That's not needed. That's not needed either. Okay, so I'll just, I might read it at the end, but I'll just get to the text because I do genuinely believe the text is much better at this. Okay, so we look at when we look at this age, this age in general, which is England after the whole period of the Roman and Greek influence. After Chaucer, basically, if you look at after Chaucer, after Chaucer's time, even though there was a single work, Chaucer's work, The Monk. It was the only critical work of importance at the time, and even that wasn't that important. So no critical work worth the name was produced in England till about the middle of 16th century. So from all the way back to the past to the middle of 16th century, there was no critical works of importance. It was only after the Renaissance came to England when the Greek and Latin treatises on criticism became available to English scholars. So the whole Greek, Latin, and Roman works that we talked about earlier, they became available to the English. How? Because the Renaissance, the people moved, the move from Italy to England, the migration that caused the movement of literature as well as knowledge, right? So the English scholars, got access to these literary works of Greek and Latin. They began to apply their minds to this department of literature. So now, this again, I believe this is like one of the most important parts in the history, but ma'am never even mentioned it in class. It is the Cambridge Friends of the Tudor period. There were three critics who, studied and grew up in Cambridge, who were of very important, historic context in this. They were, I don't think you need to know their names, just their importance. It was Sir John Cheek, Roger Ascham, and Thomas Wilson. They were called the Cambridge School. Now, their name is not what important. What they did is what's important. Their criticism followed a double trend of adoring the classic as a model of guide and advocating the purity of native tongues of all foreign languages. So simultaneously, they believed that you should look back to the classics as a guide and a model, not something you should blindly follow, but as something in okay, I'm not too much into photography, but I've heard people say it a lot. In photography, when you're getting into it, you should learn all the rules of photography so that you can break them better. So that's what they believed in. They believed that every poet should know the models and guides of classicals, so that once they practice that and get good with it, they can break it and become better poets. So they adored the classics as a model and guide, not to be blindly followed. And on the other hand, they also advocate for the purity of native tongue from all foreign languages. They believed that every single foreign language, no matter how small or insignificant their history might look, have their own importance, and that their history and their linguistic development should be independent from other influences. Although influences may happen, they shouldn't be completely overshadowed by it. So English as a language and literature should be allowed to evolve by themselves. French should evolve from themselves. Should evolve from themselves. Their object was to improve English for literary and other purposes along classical lines, but not to denationalize it by excessive borrowings from classical and other sources. That's what I say. They believed that influences should come. You should be inspired. You should have the capacity to inspire others. There should be that exchange of information between the English, the Latin, the Greek, and the Roman, and whatever. But it shouldn't come at the cost of absolute imitation to the point that you just become a blind mockery or a blind imitation of the other, and you lose all your historic value. As a nation, English had their literary identity, and and these Cambridge scholars believed they should follow that. Yes, you should be inspired by the Greeks and Romans and Latins, but you shouldn't let them completely take over your history and your culture. You should be inspired by that, adapt it, and grow your own history. That's what they believed. Now, that's all there is to it. Them, they wrote a lot, they talked a lot, they were critics, and after that become the Areopagus. Areopagus. I believe it's called Areopagus. 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 Whatever. It was in 1579, and they were actually a literary circle of a group of people who came together. It was formed at the house of the Earl of Leicester, which I do believe becomes important later in history. They were basically just a group of scholars who all came together with a collective purpose. They aimed at reforming the English words by substituting the Greek and Latin system of prosody for the English. So, if you look back at history in on itself, when we talk about English literature, you can look at it two ways, right? Literature written in English and the literature that grew in England by the English people, right? There's two. Now, when we study literary history, we started at Plato. So we took the first half, which is basically just, that. But when you look at English, the things that grew in English, it is actually, we did study the miracle plays, the morality plays, the mystery plays. That's actually the English, the canon or the history of the traditions in England. Now, these tragedies, these. drama that we talked about, Plato and Aristotle, that's not technically born or grew in England. That's outside. That came from outside, right? So these people in the Areopagus believed that instead of just following the English words by following the Greek and Latin systems of these old classicals, they should follow their own prosody for the English. They wanted to form a new system. They wanted to have the classical system of versification based on the exact quantity of syllables instead of accent. This is a bit complicated to understand, but basically all there is that the classical systems, the poetry's flow and prosody was based on an accent system, but they wanted to change that for a syllable system, which is what we follow now, right? When we talk of poems, we count syllables for the meter. So they basically succeeded in it. They wanted a system of versification based on the quantity of syllables, and in place of rhyme common in English words, they advocated unrhymed classical meters. They were the ones who, basically bought unrhymed verses. They said you need not have rhymes to have a poetry. You can have unrhymed classical meters in hexameters, for example. English poetry have been in a bad way since the death of Chaucer, they believed, and they all turned naturally to the classics to set it back on its feet again. Now, if you look at the members, a lot of these members are actually very familiar to us. There's Edward Dyer, there is Spencer, Edmund Spencer, Gabriel Harvey, and most importantly, Sir Philip Sidney. Now, they all wrote their own verses. I believe, except for Harvey, it was only Gabriel Harvey who truly wrote this way, while the all others also continue to write in both ways. Now, that's the main major critical growth that happened in the age, and this is like one of the most important things that happens in history at the time. And it was not taken in class. I don't know why. Now we come to the attack on poetry. It happened in the same year, 1579. There was an immense critical controversy that happened in England. That was the attack on poetry, which and the defense that happened after by partly occasioned again by the impact of the Renaissance. So we'll look at the society, the Elizabethan age, arguably one of considered as one of the greatest, developmental period for the common people, because you could say the Victorian age, but the common people were negatively affected by it, right? So the Elizabethan age was glorious age in English history due to various reasons. The Catholic Church moved, and the foundations of the English Anglican Church it became secure. The poor were put on a road to prosperity. The poor were given a new chance. They could grow. They could establish themselves. The classist system, although not completely removed, was abolished for a large part. The Spanish threat to security of England was ended by the defeat of the Armada at the sea. The sea power of England increased. So, if you just look at the history, Queen Elizabeth was a glorious age in English history. Foundation of English Church. The Catholic was changed for the Anglican Church. The poor were, they were given an opportunity to reach prosperity. The Spanish Armada was defeated. England became powerful in the sea. Trade routes to the east opened for the first time. In a long time in history, they finally were able to connect to the Oriental nations that we say. They got access to various trade routes by foot and by sea. The people were assured of peace at home. There was a steady flow of ancient learning from Greece and Rome. Now that, the Catholic Church, who was constantly against the ideas of those coming from the, East, was gone, there was proper, flow of trade, of commerce, and most importantly, of intelligence, of, literature work, of philosophies from Rome and Greece. This ancient learning just grew like massively. This, coupled with the blessings of peace and progress, ushered in an era of unprecedented literary activity in poetry, drama, and criticism. The English connected back to its past, while at the same time they got influences from the East. It was huge for them. The poets wrote freely, the critics discoursed freely. There was a constant flow of back and forth. Now, here's the important thing. Okay, before we get into this, there is one thing you have to like understand properly about this. Just because you personally agree with one school of literature doesn't immediately invalidate the other. Just because you think one school of poetry or one school of literature is arguably, in your opinion, better, that doesn't necessarily equate the other being bad, right? This is like very visible in literary circles. If you go higher up in the chain, you can see like a lot of the older folk in the community are blind set on following the classical themes. I do believe ma'am talked about this in class, while simultaneously at the same time, a lot of the younger, like me, for example, I wouldn't personally say, I believe that, but there are a lot of younger who believe in the absolute freedom of expression to the point that, it stops being literature to an extent. Like it's like it's a very commonly debated about topic, and if I get into it, it just become a huge debacle on itself. But you can't just tell someone this and this is poetry, while at the same time you can't just write a single word and call it poetry, can you? I mean, you could, but is it poetry though? Like, that's the question, right? Now, and this is another thing, just because, okay, personally, if I say I really like the classical views, I do believe genuinely in this day and age a lot of classical values can come back and it would lead to great effect in literature. That doesn't immediately mean I'm against anyone who's not classical, right? I love the poems of Keats. For example, if we talk about the thing that's about to come here, Stephen Gossen's Code for Abuse and Philip Sidney's um, Defense of Poesy. Both of these work, I actually, I tried reading School of Abuse. I understood like parts of it, not completely. It was very tough, but I did complete Defense of Poesy. It was easy to read. Both of them give very good arguments actually. You just can't say, okay, yeah, Gosson wrote something, but Philip Sidney absolutely destroyed it in his replies, and the School for Abuse was totally destroyed. No, it did actually give us a lot of information. It was necessary, because think about it. If School of Abuse was never written, Defense of Poesy wouldn't have been written either. It is this constant challenging, the back and forth challenging, that brings up the quality of literature, right? There is a reason in a democracy an opposing party is given power when the ruling parties exist. You need to question the authority of the one who is at the power now, so that development can happen. If modern age never existed, we would have never gotten postmodern period. If classical period never existed, we wouldn't have gotten the Renaissance, the Romantic period. The Victorian age wouldn't have happened if the Romantic period never existed, right? They have to go hand in hand. Yes, they are the opposites. Yes, they will abuse and talk bad about each other, but they are necessary, right? You need like, we all need to stop, blindly following just one school while ignoring every other school. Now, for example, like, you could take views on it. If you are talking to someone who's a blind follower of the romantics, you could take the side of the classic and argue against that. If you see someone who's a blind follower of the classical, you could take a metaphysical view and question them, right? That's what you're supposed to do. That's how you grow in a literary view. You have to question every view there is. You have to challenge them. Then only growth will happen. That's exactly what these critics did. And that is why it is considered like one of the best literary periods of the time, sheerly due to the critical value that we give. I went a lot of out of topic, but if you come back to it, okay. In the age came one of the greatest literary, criticism and true criticism. And by criticism here, I mean complaining and scrutinizing literature came Stephen Gosson's School for Abuse. It was a treatise. Free discussion of poetry came in attack from Puritans and the harmful effects of the morals. Here's what he come. He called, without actually, okay, this was kind of an ice-hole move, but, Stephen Gosson wrote School for Abuse and dedicated it to Sir Philip Sidney without even telling Philip Sidney he's doing that. And he called poetry a pleasant, no, he called this work, The School of Abuse, as a pleasant invective against poets, pipers, players, jesters, and such like caterpillars of a commonwealth. Basically, he called it a work of criticism, a work where I'm calling you out. Basically, today's equivalent is a post I'm making on Twitter as I cancel you on the poets, pipers, players, gestures. So basically, anyone who supports the views on art as caterpillars to the republic, to the commonwealth, for the government, for the well-being of the people, these pillars are equal. These people are equal to caterpillars. They're waste. They're useless. They're almost like a parasite. It's what he's saying. It denounces. Okay, here are the things that he says. He denounces the poets as the father of lies. A poet is the father of a lies, and he makes a lot of comparisons here. So here the importance is that Gaussian, and this is the thing that people forget a lot. These anti-classicists who are against classicists forget a lot. Gaussian, just like Plato, is not attacking poetry or drama in on itself. He's attacking the abuse of poetry and drama that was being done by many people. You know, again, this is basically saying, if I say, okay, that's a bad example. I just thought of an example to say, but that's a very bad example. Basically, he's saying, I'm not against poetry and drama, but if you keep using poetry and drama to spread X and Y things, which I am personally against, I will say it's bad. That's all. Because the thing is that Gaussen was a huge follower of Plato, and he himself wrote poems a lot. He himself believed that Plato's verses, which he did write in verse, were good. He believed, again, just like Plato, the moral values need to come back. But it was taken. But the way he presented that was not too good. He was very aggressive with it, which led to the history being history. Um he meant that by good plays, he did believe good plays need to come, good poetry need to come. He meant not those that were artistically perfect, but those that were morally wholesome. It needs to be moral, virtuous. Aesthetics did not interest him. He didn't believe in art for art's sake. He believed art has to serve a purpose. Now, the work School of Abuse had two replies, immediate replies. One, the less famous one, the title of the text is unknown. It was written by Thomas Lodge. We have learnt of him. The title of it is lost. It was basically, authority of the great. He is talking back to, how dare you question these policies. It was an emotional response. However, Sidney wrote the second one, which we all know as Philip Sidney's An Apology for Poetry or the Defense of Poetry, written in 1580. And this was the more famous work. Now, both of these sides made copious use of their new classical learning. The denouncers poetry offered drawing on Plato and defenders. Okay, so it's same thing again. Plato versus Aristotle. If you do look back at history, the entire thing of literary debate is just Plato versus Aristotle. In this age, Gaussen versus Sidney is basically Plato versus Aristotle. You look back at the view of modernist versus postmodernist. Again, it's just classical versus sorry, Plato versus Aristotle. History is repeating itself. Now, the thing to note here is that again, both sides made huge contributions to literature. Now, before we get completely into Sydney, there's one last part, which is the debate on the native and the classic, which is I talked about earlier when we talking about the trio, the Cambridge trio. Now, there was another critical question that arose at the age, which questioned what path do we follow from here on out? Because if you look at the history, they have the Latin influence, they have the Greek influence, they have the Roman influence, they have their own history of miracle, mystery, and miracle plays. They have the new coming, literature from France and Italy. Which path do we follow to the future? We have to create a literary canon. We have to follow that. Which do we? They had major options as this: the native, as exemplified in the mystery and miracle cycles and the moralities and interludes that grew in England itself through the church. Like what I just choose that, or the classical shown in the performance of Greek and Latin plays of schools and colleges. Those were the two major choices. Now, there were a lot of back and forth, and everyone stating their opinion as to what they would think is better. It is, I would say it's not even hard. It's impossible to say which one is, perfect or which one is better because there's a lot of conditions that go on here. But there were a lot of people that believed in either, Marlowe and Shakespeare believed in following the native, whereas Harvey Spencer, Campion, Philip Sidney, Ben Jonson all followed the classics. There was a lot of back and forth. Spencer and Sidney, two very famous people, were divided in their loyalties. They both did follow. No, sorry, they both believed the classical would be better, but they never really followed it. That's what's important. Because if you look at history and you say, okay, I preach X, but I do Y, am I hypocrite? Am I necessarily though? That's the question. Because I could preach for one thing. I could say this is better for the ideal, but the situation here is not ideal. So I could still follow that, right? Because I, for example, I believe in an ideal world, we wouldn't need private transportation because public transportation should cover all that is necessary. But I will still own a bicycle. In the future, I might still drive a car. Why? Because it is not an ideal world, right? Does that make me a hypocrite? Or does that make me a practical man? Right? That's the question. Sidney and Spencer, they both supported the classics. They both believed the classics would be better. The proper application of the classics, which is a combination of the views of Horace, Plato, Aristotle, and Longinus, right? That would serve best for the people. However, they still wrote in a quasi-Renaissance romantic way. That does not make them hypocrites. That makes them practical people, right? The same argument is made for Plato. The same argument is made for Aristotle. And with that, the historic part is done. Next, we start Philip Sidney. Before that, let me just quickly check the notes. The rise of criticism during the time we talked about. There was a need for understanding of the function and nature of poetry. Um, there was a confusion, like people didn't know what poetry need to be for. The confusion from the history. What history do they follow? Medieval view regarding poetry as a toy or versified rhetoric rather than art. New courtly circles under Queen Elizabeth's patronage, as we talked about. Various courtly circles started at the time, just like the Areopagus or the Cambridge Trio. Puritan effect. This was also the time where the Puritans were at mass. They were trying to ban all kinds of art. So it was also like the Sydney's views were also kind of like an antithesis to that as well. And then we start Apology for Poetry. Yeah, that's all I believe. Neoclassical believed in tendency in literature to return to values of ancient Greek and Romans. Neoclassicists were to extend Renaissance era to humanism. Okay, basically that's all. Next, we'll look at Sir Philip Sidney.